So welcome to our latest webinar, Exploring the World of Environmental Monitoring. Today we're joined by Melinda Haunton, Archives Accreditation Programme Manager at TNA. Melinda will be discussing what accreditation assessors look for in terms of environmental control and how it fits more broadly within the policy and planning of an archive service. And I will now pass you over to Melinda. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Robert, and thanks everyone for turning up. I'm just going to share my screen and hopefully you can now see my slide deck. Robert, if you can confirm that.
Yes, it's all there, thank you.
Fantastic.
It's not in presentation mode, that's the only thing. Yeah.
Oh, that's odd.
It is now, sorry, just as I said it went, thank you.
Okay, it might blink because I went out of it and went back in case that helped, but as long as it's in presentation mode now, we're good to go. Okay, so thank you for that introduction and thank you for the invitation to speak. I'm Melinda Haunton, as Robert says. I'm the Programme Manager for UK Archive Service Accreditation, which means I'm based at the National Archives in Kew, and I'll be using our black and white slide deck today. But obviously in this context, I want to emphasise that we are a partnership programme, and I've added the logos of all three of our partners who have a presence in Scotland. SCA, our host today, National Records of Scotland and the Archives and Records Association, just as a reminder that this isn't just a TNA thing, it's very much a UK-wide partnership. This session, we're obviously going to look at environmental monitoring specifically, and as Robert said, this is very much to show you how it sits within the context of the accreditation standard, but also generally in the running of an archive service. So I hope it will be useful to you, even if you're not currently thinking about filling in an accreditation form. It's really important to start by saying, I am not a conservator. If you want the conservation science, please look back at the recording of webinar 1 with Jane Henderson. I've looked at it and learned quite a lot. She talked incredibly helpfully about the science behind the wiggly lines, and made me slightly intimidated about running this session, but hopefully I'm going to come at it from a very different angle, which will equally be useful to you. What I'm going to be talking about is how that issue of environmental monitoring fits into managing an archive service. Because it's my own environment and where I'm comfortable, I'm going to do that very much through the structures of Archive Service Accreditation. Really showing you kind of where environmental monitoring fits, but also potentially where it connects across the piece in service management. And to do that, I am going to let you into some secrets. I'm partly going to talk like an accreditation assessor, what we think when we're looking at an application from one archive service and considering how it's performing in this area. What kinds of factors help us to understand whether that service is in a good managed place, or whether we need to be thinking about the rubric that we have for when accreditation might not be awarded because of unidentified, unmitigated, or unmanaged risk. So apologies for those of you who know accreditation like the back of your hand, but I'm just going to put up a couple of these diagrams that show the structures of Archive Service Accreditation. And I'm going to drill down to show you where the bits that are specifically about storage environments sit within the standard. On the left here, we've got the 3 modules that make up accreditation. So it's structured as organisational health, which is very much around governance, planning and resourcing. There's a collections management module, which I'm going to come back to. And the 3rd module is around stakeholders and their experiences, policy planning and what you do day to day with the people that engage with your archive service. On the right of this slide is the headline structure of the collections management module. So that's the 2nd one within accreditation, and that looks in very broad terms at what is collected, what isn't collected, or what is appraised, and then how what you've collected is described, and then how it's cared for. And it won't surprise you to know that as we drill down yet further into the collections module, we get to collection care. Within that structure, we always ask about policy and planning in all aspects of collections management. But when you get right down to it, the bit of accreditation that asks no messing about what the environmental conditions are like in your repositories, it's going to be all the way down at section 2.4.3, which is collection care procedures. So I'm going to start there. But I warn you now, I'm going to be zooming right back out over the course of the talk just to think about how all of this connects into management of an archive service in total, because as I'm sure you're all aware, it's not just as simple as applying a couple of procedures and that can stand alone and have nothing to do with anything else you do in your archive. This is an extract from the accreditation application form as it currently is, which contains the only 3 questions that are very specifically about storage environments. And one of those is actually broader than that. It asks for a general sense of where your storage doesn't meet current storage standards, or indeed the previous storage standard, if that's what it was built to. That's obviously a much wider question than just environmental monitoring and management, but responses in that area often do talk about temperature and relative humidity readings, because that's something that people find that you have to do constantly and consider constantly. When it's something like fire compartmentation or something, it's either built that way or it's not built that way, whereas environments are something that we find that you do constantly have to keep an eye on. You can't simply say this was spec'd out in 2001 to meet the standard then and the end. It's not necessarily doing that 22 years on, if that is the situation that you're in. The next question on the application form actually asks for the readings. What is going on in your storage, and that's across all stores, including out stores, and across a year, so that we can get a real sense of change across the seasons. And the last specific question asks about any issues with the data that you have submitted. So basically, what's happened to create anything that looks a bit weird in the readings? Did someone go on holiday? Did the data loggers not download? Is that blip because of a calibration problem? Whatever it is that made for the wonderful zigs, zags, and gaps that we do quite often see in environmental monitoring. And the underlying question of that is, of course, how well do you understand the data that you've got? It's tempting, if you actually are putting in an accreditation application, just to look at the questions you've got to fill in with a kind of tunnel vision. But I would always advise you to look at the program guidance, because that gives you a lot of the context for what we're asking and why we're asking and why we care and what kinds of things we're looking for. So this is the general bit of guidance around collections care procedures. It's an extract from it. It's a couple of pages long. I didn't think you would appreciate me screen sharing the entire thing. But this gives you an idea of some of the things that we're looking for. So collections care procedures are important because they're pivotal to the longevity of collections. So that's obviously really quite a critical thing in terms of your performance as an archive service. Equally, you might note there are some languages like quality. Is what you're doing actually working? Consistency. Is everyone doing it? Are you sure? Assuming there's more than one of you. Or even if there is one of you, do you do the same thing month in, month out? And the methodology. So what are you actually doing? And under that list of what assessment is looking for, the bullet points go way off the end of this slide, but you can see when we talk about environmental monitoring control, we do ask specifically about temperature, lighting, and relative humidity. Lighting, again, is one of those things that very often is essentially an on-off question. Temperature and relative humidity can be a lot more complex. So that's what's written down in accreditation, which you could have looked up before this seminar, and maybe you have. So what I want to talk about now is, what does that actually amount to? What would I or any accreditation assessor be thinking about when looking at the answers to those few questions in the application, and about collection care procedures in general? I want to emphasize at this point, accreditation is never about pass fail. It's never about saying, well, if you don't do it that way, then you're wrong. It's all about service specific issues. So I can't give you a sort of perfect tick list of, if we do all this, then we're absolutely right to be accredited, because the person in the next archive along from you is going to be facing a completely different range of issues, a completely different range of building setups, and so on. So it's all going to be contextual, but these are kind of general questions. And as Jane Henderson said in her webinar, environmental monitoring is all about people and about resources. It's not just about having the wiggly lines and producing them and saying, we monitor, we monitor. So as assessors, primarily what we'll be doing is thinking about risks. We'll obviously actually look at the data itself and spot whether there are evident risks from the conditions themselves. So for example, an obvious one is very persistently high humidity, which obviously does all kinds of no good to the archives. And then there are more nuanced things. So for example, if there are short, sharp changes in environment around a basically stable midpoint, for a start, what's causing that? Is it extremely twitchy monitoring equipment that notices every time someone opens a door? Or is it perhaps some sort of sensor problem, so that automated systems are overreacting to slight changes to produce quite a jagged approach. And in either of those cases, are all the collections actually in boxes? And as long as the average is in a pretty good place, then maybe that's not actually having much impact on the collections. Or is there lots of fragile unboxed material whose edges are going to be steadily getting embrittled, or anything that might be impacted by condensation and so on? So lots of things that might be a problem in the readings, but aren't necessarily. It's not all about looking for a perfect smooth line. And of course, if all of your material is in packaging, has anyone checked what's happening inside the boxes? Does it look as if things are fine, but actually when you check, things are getting slowly damper over time in the boxes in a way that isn't reflected in your graphs? And that, as I'm sure Jane mentioned this, that's particularly if you have a nagging worry about conditions, but your lines on your monitoring graphs look absolutely beautiful. That's possibly a time to start looking at what's actually happening inside the boxes, because almost all your sensors will just be measuring room air. And it's not just looking at the data. There's a load of questions that we'd want to ask around those readings, to think about whether the monitoring that you've got in place is actually supporting your service. And because those are going to be really different across services, we might ask about those on a validation visit, for example, rather than expecting you to answer lots of written questions about them. One, which is on the application form, is that awareness of current collection care standards and thinking about how you're managing any risk that comes from where you don't quite match up. If you're, I don't know, half a degree in temperature average over what's ideal, but everything else is performing pretty well, is that something you're desperately worried about? Probably not. But equally, you know, we'd want to be for there to be an awareness of how collection care standards have changed. If services are still really fighting to meet extremely rigorous standards that were set in 2000, then have you thought about where you don't match up to those and whether a more up-to-date approach with conservation standards might be realistic? And we'll also think about stuff like, okay, so you're monitoring your environments, but who can actually see what the conditions are? And when can you see what the conditions are? How easy is it to get readings? Do you have to fight with software or an IT department or a facilities department to know what's going on in your repository? Or can you just check as you walk around, or maybe have a desktop reading that you can check? Do you even wander around with a thermohygrometer paranoidally checking whether what the readings are is seen on spot readings as well? And who looks at the data and interprets it? And that's both in terms of who's aware day to day of what the conditions are and spotting problems, and who's looking at long-term trends. This was something I was thinking about in Jane's webinar, where she talked about looking at monthly or quarterly problem spotting with readings. And I agree that looking at the medium term and the long term data is really, really important. But I have seen some things as an assessor. I have literally seen a graph where half of a plant room blew up while a conservator was on holiday. And because the other half of the plant took over and stabilized, it just looked like a weird little jag in the graph. And it wasn't until they came back from leave and said, what's going on here, that anyone realized there was a problem with the machinery. Obviously, when I say blew up, a fuse went rather than, actual fire. But nonetheless, you can sometimes find that you really do need that day-to-day awareness of whether there's something a bit odd going on with your readings. Equally, last summer, I've just heard a really horrible story of where a cold store failed on the hottest day of the year, or indeed of the ever, and started to suck in external air. And the humidity went up 20% in about 5 hours, which is the kind of thing that very much damages material in a cold store, and you'd want to know is happening as quickly as possible. But it's not all about that kind of immediate disaster. And indeed, I hope it's not about that kind of immediate disaster for any of you. That's the first time I've ever heard of that happening, and it was horrendous. There is that question also about long-term performance. Are there subtle issues that could be picked up about how this environment has maybe shifted a bit over time that suggests there's something changing either with plants or with the external ambience? And are there things that you could be doing that might save you carbon or money or both, in terms of maybe easing back a bit from very highly specified conditions? And of course, the absolute practicalities. How often are your sensors calibrated so that you know that the readings are actually accurate? And some people, for example, have automated sensors and then some sort of data loggers or handheld monitors just to check those. If they don't match up, how do you tell which one's gone wrong? Really interesting, different practice in different repositories about that. And are you seeing any mold? I'm not going to go on and on and on about mold, but I do want to say that we've had about 200 services apply for accreditation in the first 9 years of the programme's existence, and 28 of them have seen mold in some forms. Some of it's old, inactive mold, but nonetheless, it's something that is a very, very real issue, even for services that are well along the road to accreditation. And mold can obviously be expensive and damaging in all kinds of ways. The kind of things that we've seen services having to do or wanting to do when they have found mold, reviewing what systems you've got to maintain the environment, potentially replacing plant, which obviously comes at a big cost. Temporary dehumidification, better, not ideal, but certainly cheaper. You might need to call in someone like Harwell if you've got a really big issue that you cannot deal with in-house. In the most extreme cases, you might need to get out of your stores. If I've seen at least one wall turn porous in an underground bunker that used to have beautifully stable conditions, and over time that concrete had just started to suck in moisture from outside, and there was no way of rectifying that, and the store had to be replaced. And there are people impacts as well. So you might need to think about closing sections of the collection to public access and thinking about communicating that, which isn't always the easiest message to send out. You'll certainly have to be thinking about cleaning programs to remove mold from collections. And you might want to think, sometimes mold, particularly in the last 3 years, seems to have come about because things had changed. Maybe nobody had been in a strong room for a long period of time, or that doors hadn't been opened and boxes hadn't been taken off shelves very much because a public service wasn't running as usual. So there have been some exceptional reasons in the last few years why I think this has been cropping up a bit more. But if none of that applies, is there something that you maybe need to do in terms of collections checking and conditions monitoring to keep on top of that if it ever looks like it might be happening again? Okay, I'm going to move away from mold because it's a scary thing. What I don't want anyone to leave this webinar thinking is that there's only one right answer to environmental monitoring and management. The answer isn't always to have some space age machine building management system running 24/7 with remote monitoring. You can get very effective environmental conditions with much more passive approaches or temporary use of systems at periods of high humidity or high temperature. You might just get really, really lucky and find that you've got a store that keeps pretty stable at very little intervention and be very happy with how that's going and not really want to try interfering with it. And as long as that's supported by effective monitoring so that you know if something is starting to creep out of whack, then that will be absolutely fine. And those of you that have never had one, I would also say that building management systems are not always a dream answer anyway. They may be the only option for larger services with lots of strong rooms that need lots of intervention to keep them stable. But equally, you can quite often see a big disjuncture between the people that installed them, who are very often not the people who are then going to have to run them, who are equally very often not the people who are actually responsible for the collections that are being managed by those systems. So that can be both complicated and, if it goes wrong, really quite costly for long-term running and for maintenance. There's a reason why conservation standards have been changing since 2000. The kind of specifications that were set in 2000, the kind of thing that I learned at Archive during my Archive qualification, were necessary, with very, very tight parameters on temperature and humidity and very little fluctuation even across a year, let alone in a day. conservation standards have moved away from this for many reasons: cost, environmental impact, that it's actually quite unrealistic for most plant to keep up that kind of service over years. And also recognition that striving for those very narrow parameters can sometimes have dramatic and unforeseen consequences when it all starts to go a bit wrong and then slides out of control. Okay, as I said earlier, I want to draw my focus back away from the very, very specific issues of how you monitor conditions and respond to those readings. Because although obviously spotting mold or that weird temperature rise day to day is really important, there are approaches to how you manage your collections environments that need to be considered at a policy level or a planning level. So at a policy level, for example, have you articulated what you're aiming for as a service, particularly if you're not actually aiming to meet the current standards in absolute full? Because at a policy level, you can talk about why. We're in a converted building, we're in a listed building. We think that the carbon cost of this is excessive for the very small benefit that we might get by dropping the temperature by that ½ degree I mentioned earlier, or something like that. And then at a planning level, being aware of emerging risks or having just an ongoing plan for dealing with stuff that you know is a potential risk. A classic one is high summer humidity, which means that you might well need portable dehumidification for a couple of months in the year, and just having that ready for when you need it, and having resource available to check when you need it, plug it in, empty the dehumidifier as often as it needs, which is nobody's favorite task, but nonetheless can be part of the rhythm of planning for what you need to do as an archive service. And that isn't just at the procedures level, it's about knowing that you're probably going to need to tackle some of this. Equally, at both policy and planning level, it's really important to be aware of the specifics of the collections that you have and how that impacts what you're trying to do. So if you have vulnerable acetate or VHS in your collections and you can't immediately send them out for digitization, then some archives really, really need to get to grips with that, really need urgently to be thinking about cold storage, as is made clear by the current crop of collection care standards. Others don't have that material, or maybe have a couple of things, sending them out for digitization as a priority in the current year, everything's going to be fine. So that kind of approach that's very, very collection centered is absolutely vital. Oops, sorry. And equally, the issues that you're thinking about in terms of collection care may not be so much about what's in your repositories in terms of setup or in terms of collections, but it might be about where you're located and your adjacencies. If you've got a lovely quiet store that's just been ticking over beautifully for a long time, and it's next to a room that's been used to store spare furniture, and someone comes along and says, "Can we make that into a staff kitchen maybe?" or a lab, or an office that's going to have PCs running all the time, or a computer server room, that's potentially going to impact what happens to your store, and you may need to plan to either switch up how you monitor or have a formal review about how your conditions are performing X amount of time after that location specific change has happened, and maybe negotiate some funding for whatever you need to do to rectify those faults. And equally, if someone's put a lab or a kitchen right next to your store, then you're going to need to have a look at your emergency plan as well and think about, have those risks rather shifted and changed? And I'm zooming back my focus now to look at the whole of the accreditation standard at requirement level, and just thinking about what doesn't fall into the collections care area of running your service. Some of the things that might happen with storage environments may have bigger costs and may have bigger impacts, and really can't be dealt with just by thinking about it in terms of what's in the repository. Sometimes that's purely on a cost basis. So obviously, if you do have a lot of systems and plant running and they're getting towards the end of their life, then you need to be starting to think about how that's going to be replaced and funded, and if there are any studies you need to do about whether you could maybe take a less interventive approach. And none of that is probably going to come out of the budget line that you have for, I don't know, £300 for new boxes in a year. Quite clearly, you're going to need some sort of institutional support for that. Equally, this is why I've highlighted collections development as a question with one of my red circles here. It might be about what you take in and what you are able to preserve. If your collections are largely paper-based and you've got a repository that's performing well for that, and someone offers you something in a rare and fragile format, is it ethical to acquire it? So do you need to have something in your collections development policy that says, we don't take this kind of thing, or we might be able to take it, but you have to understand we're not guaranteeing that we can keep it in as good conditions as we do for paper-based collections or whatever your specialisms are. And you might need to think about people and stakeholders. Are there elements of your environmental management that impact on use? Cold storage, for example, has obvious implications for how fast you can produce material. If you're relying on a largely passive environmental control strategy and you have a lot of small, strong rooms, then anything that you used to do that involved people being in those stores for long periods of time, exuding, breath and warmth as people do, drat us all, you might need to rethink that, because a passive environment may be less able to cope with that kind of approach. And of course, energy costs and carbon impacts are things that we're all thinking about at present. Decisions about the approach that you take to managing environments can have very, very direct budget impacts, particularly right at the moment. Or equally, institutionally, you may get pressure from above. You may be thinking about it as an archive yourself. You might be changing your whole thinking around collections care and environmental management strategy, on the understanding that it's all very well preserving things beautifully in your repository, but if the entire world overheats, that probably wasn't the priority. We're definitely seeing collection care standards become more flexible and connected to whole life costing and carbon impact. That's been consistent over the last 10 years or so. So is that reflected in your strategy? Is it time to start thinking about it? It's definitely something that we're thinking about. We're just coming up to accreditation's 10th anniversary at the end of this year, and we're just shaping the review of the programme. And this is one thing where we want to have a conversation with the sector about, is there more that we could and should be doing around issues like carbon impact? So I'm going to wind up now. If you have any takeaways from this, I would definitely suggest number one is monitoring is only useful if you use it. Otherwise, it really is just a set of wiggly lines and you may as well use them as wallpaper. From my point of view, accreditation is a holistic standard. So of course, environmental monitoring is just one aspect of that bigger picture. But the implications of what you see in your monitoring and your storage conditions are really vital. They can have impact across the service, and they fundamentally impact what you're trying to do as an archive. And everything needs to be super service specific, based on awareness of the standards, sure, but also on understanding your risks and understanding the specifics of your collections, your premises, and their limitations. And we can all do that. We can all understand the spaces that we're actually occupying. So if you can do that, you can get accredited. I have one last slide, which I'll leave up a couple of seconds so that you can take down the contacts and information. We host the main accreditation site on the National Archives website, so that all the guidance and things are up to date and in one place there. But if you are planning an application from Scotland, please have a look at the SCA website for details on what to do next. And that's me.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Melinda. Lots of useful guidance there and many things to consider, especially about mould and trying not to breathe within a store. So if you do have any questions, please either you can click the raise the hand button and I can switch on your microphone, or alternatively, please do type them into the Q&A box and we'll get to them. One such question has already come in, and it is, does the trend to combine and share services within one location or building potentially create challenges, e.g. with commercial partners or other local authority organisations, for instance? And do you have advice on how to manage that?
Yeah, so I don't think it necessarily creates more risk, because you may be through that partnership in a much stronger position to create standards that you actually want, and maybe collectively stronger to demand that they continue at that level. But what I think it does do is create potential complexity. And I would say it's really important from the outset to be clear about things like who has control of the environmental monitoring, who gets to see it, how often, and what do you do to escalate when there's a problem. And if those lines of communication are longer, particularly for things like escalating, if there's an immediate problem, if you then have to go through, well, you have to activate the partnership agreement and get sign off from 2 or 3 organizations before we can contact facilities and say, I think we need a plumber, then, you know, that is a really tricky situation to be in. So I would say keep communication lines and agreements as simple and clear as you can in this. But otherwise, I think there's lots of positives to think about going in together. Archive storage is a really, really specific kind of need, and a lot of people who are trying to create storage will be working with organisations that have never done this before. So the greater critical mass you can get of people saying, no, seriously, we do need it to be like this. You can't just put us above this grill over the kitchen or something. Then I think the better.
Thank you very much. I think that also very much came through in some things that Jane Henderson said, is knowing who to speak to within your organisation. And we will also hopefully be having a session on how to actually communicate to those other people what you need as well. There are no other questions coming through yet, so I think that you have answered everyone's queries, Melinda.
I mean, do get absolutely.